Well, thank you for the opportunity to co-sponsor this event tonight with you. Welcome, everyone. Exploration, the Globe and Beyond is an Andrew Mellon Foundation lecture series in the Division of the Humanities and Social Sciences here at Caltech. Our lectures aim at bringing together a broad community, scientists, engineers, social scientists, humanists, artists, and the general public, around the topic of exploration, all the way from antiquity to the present, and from early exploration of the globe to the exploration of our solar system. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker, Christian Davenport of the Washington Post. Mr. Davenport writes about the defense and space industries for the Post's financial desk. His coverage since joining the newspaper in 2000 spans all the way from the DC area sniper shootings to the human rights violation scandal of Abu Ghraib prison, which earned him and his team at the Post a nomination for the Pulitzer Prize in 2005. In 2010, Mr. Davenport was awarded the University of Georgia's Peabody Award for his work on veterans with traumatic brain injury. He is the author of As You Were, To War and Back with the Black Hawk Battalion of the Virginia National Guard, which was published by John Wiley & Sons in 2009. This book follows the heart-wrenching stories of soldiers who soon found themselves struggling to re-enter civil society after fighting the war in Iraq. Today, Mr. Davenport presents quite a different story. As citizens of the 21st century, we inhabit some of the worlds that writers across the ages have imagined for humanity. Reaching at least as far back as Lucian's True History in the 2nd century, humans have envisioned space travel in one form or another, extraterrestrial life, interplanetary war, or peace. And in this way, they have planted the seeds of the future that has, in multiple ways, become our very own present. The story we're about to hear from Mr. Davenport wields all the basic elements of truly compelling fiction. A near-fatal helicopter crash out of a canyon near Cathedral Mountain in West Texas, a secretive Seattle-based corporation called Zevram Limited Liability Company, buying out ranchers in Texas's Culberson and Hudspeth counties, and the idea of building a gigantic mega bullwhip to snap cargo out to space in the blink of an eye. Except this is not the stuff of science fiction, but expert reporting by one of our nation's top reporters. Tonight, he will talk to us about his new book, The Space Barons, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and the Quest to Colonize the Cosmos. Please join us in welcoming Christian Davenport.
Thanks, Nico, and thanks, Michelle and Tom, for having me, and thank for so much all of you for coming. This is a real treat to be here. As Nico mentioned, I've done a variety of things throughout my career, and I thought I might talk a little bit about how I came to the subject, because I am 45 years old. I was born in 1973 and didn't grow up with the space bug. In fact, my first memory of space was actually was homesick in 1986 when the Challenger shuttle exploded. And that was my introduction to it. And the shuttle just didn't capture the imagination, I think, of people, especially the generations that grew up with Mercury and Gemini and Apollo. And for me and a lot of my friends, it just wasn't something we were captivated by. But then I really about 5 years ago, just became really aware that there was this sort of new commercial space age, that these billionaires, these space barons, were getting involved and changing things, and that maybe now we're in sort of a new era of space. And I think we are, and I thought, this really transcends what I'm doing in my day-to-day job at the Washington Post, and that, giving it the coverage that I can, it really sort of was bigger than that. And that's why I wanted to do the book. And now, I think I have, one of the best jobs at the paper. I mean, if you think about what's going on right now, I mean, one of the hard things about writing this book is like, where does it end? I had to sort of pick an ending, and I knew from the beginning it would end sort of with an idea as opposed to a moment, because in some ways the story continued. But I thought I'd just give a brief overview of kind of, be just a glimpse of what's going on right now. But NASA has what's known as a commercial crew program to fly astronauts to the International Space Station. Here, I'm sure people are well aware, but I go around and have been talking, and it's sort of interesting to me how many people do not know that NASA does not have the ability today to fly astronauts into space, and that we haven't had that capability since 2011 when the shuttle retired. And now that's going to be restored with SpaceX and Boeing. But you've also got, just talking about human space flight, Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos' space company, and Virgin Galactic, Richard Branson's venture, getting very close to flying, paying tourists and customers to the edge of space on suborbital flights. And one of the reasons I was able to come and do this was I was just up in Mojave the past 2 days visiting with Virgin Galactic, getting a sense of their program and where they are, and meeting their test pilots, and seeing their spaceship and all of that. And it's just extraordinary to see all of that. And then while we were there, once you're up in Mojave, it's just sort of this surreal, they call it the Silicon Valley of space. It's just a really cool atmosphere. You've got this massive hangar where Virgin Galactic is, and then right next to it is another even bigger hangar for Paul Allen's space venture. Paul Allen's the co-founder of Microsoft with Bill Gates. And we saw what he's building, which is a plane called Strata Launch, which is the biggest plane, or will be the biggest plane ever to fly by wingspan. I think the wingspan is 385 feet, so that's longer than a football field with the end zones. And we saw it on the taxiway, just out and about, and it's stunning. And the idea is that will air launch rockets, and it could actually put as many as 3 rockets. It's got a twin fuselage, and sort of tether the rockets to its belly. It goes up to a cruising altitude, and the rockets drop off. So we got to see that right next door to the hangar. So it's just this extraordinary time, and there's so much going on. And Nico was saying, I do the defense industry. I've really kind of had to ignore a wide swath of my beat, my job, to just do space. And so that's sort of what's going on in the near term with human space flight. But now you've got this real return to the moon, and you've got not just these companies. SpaceX has the Falcon 9 rocket, their sort of workhorse rocket, but you probably saw earlier this year the Falcon Heavy, a much more heavy lift rocket, which on its maiden flight took off, and I was there for that. It was extraordinary. And I thought too, if you remember, because it was a test launch, it's had a dummy payload of one of Elon's actual own personal Tesla Roadster, and he announced he was going to do this. And I, as a journalist, wanted to look at that skeptically and think, couldn't there be a more responsible use of? I mean, couldn't we, find a student? Could I go to Caltech and ask, are there any student satellites or experiments we could launch? But then when I saw the Tesla, and if you saw that image of it against, the Earth, I thought it was sort of an extraordinary moment. And what I think these companies are doing when, I talk about not just being technologically competent and having the chops to, get to orbit and to fly people safely and reliably, but also to reignite interest in space and to make space cool again. And you see, kids walking around in SpaceX gear and doing all of that. So it's a really sort of interesting time. So seeing that all of this is coming, what I wanted to do in my book, The Space Barons, was sort of set out a little bit of how we got here and focus on these billionaires and sort of their visions to do that. Elon gets a lot of attention, has been getting a lot of attention recently, if you've been following the news, maybe not for all the right reasons. But he's what I find fascinating about him and all of them is just, their ability to think, just really big, in a way that, that I think that the freedom that they come to it, not, from a technical space background, that in some ways they're all sort of self-taught, and they did other things, found Amazon or Tesla and PayPal and do all these other things, but, sort of underneath it all, I think space is, their real passion. And so, Elon's goal and why he founded SpaceX, which is fairly well known, so I won't spend too much time on it, but is this idea that, he wants to colonize Mars and that we need, sort of a backup planet for humanity. It's as if, you have all your information on your laptop, but you don't have it backed up anywhere, and that if your laptop crashes, you lose it all, and that's how sort of we are with Earth, and that's sort of his North Star, if you will, to be able to do that. And he's been very public about that. But what I find really interesting is Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin, and even to this day, a lot of people don't realize that Jeff has a space company, or that actually Blue Origin was founded in 2000, 2 years before SpaceX was founded, and kept very, very quiet for years. And so, Jeff owns the Washington Post, my employer, which makes things a little bit tricky. And people say, you must have gotten special access. I said, no, I get the same sort of no comment and brush off as everyone else, because they, are not, they're becoming more open and transparent, but they weren't at first. But when I did talk to Jeff and say, really sort of, for maybe the third or fourth time, like, look, I'm writing this book, really like to talk to you, get you open up. And I said, everyone sees you through the lens of Amazon. Of course they do. But I think that to understand you, we need to see you through the lens of space, because that's your real interest. And he sees, in sort of contrast, to sort of lay out a little bit of a difference in their visions, where Elon, sort of has this plan B idea for humanity, let's go colonize another planet. Jeff's thesis is no, let's preserve Earth, right? Plan B should be to make sure that Plan A works, right? Earth is pretty great. I mean, I came from Washington, where it's still like 90 degrees and humid, but I'm driving around here in this beautiful weather and the palm trees. And as Jeff says, like, on Earth we have whiskey and bacon and waterfalls, and like it's a pretty nice place. And Mars is not it's not a pleasant place to be. You could die there fairly easily. He says his line is that Mars makes Antarctica look like a garden paradise. So what he wants to do is to essentially go out into space and have really all of the heavy industry go into space by mining asteroids and having all of the solar energy that's in space and doing manufacturing in space. And then to preserve, he says today, and he gives these speeches, that Earth essentially then is preserved, and it's should be zoned residential. And in that you go to space to preserve the Earth. And that's sort of a really interesting concept, right? If it's sort of, it's big, like colonizing Mars. But here's what's really fascinating about it. He's been giving this stump speech since he was 18 years old. When he was a valedictorian of his high school in Florida, he gave a version of that speech. And instead of saying Earth should be zoned residential, he said Earth should be maintained as a national park. Right, so this is something he's been thinking about for a long, long time. I'll tell you another story, because I come to this as a journalist, as a storyteller. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engineer. So I just find the stories fascinating. And Nico was mentioning sort of the bullwhip idea. And so one of the things that Jeff wanted to do when he founded Blue Origin, which is getting some attention today, but it was really secretive when he founded in 2000. Had about 3 employees, one of whom was the science fiction author Neil Stephenson, if you've read any of his books, like, right, his Seven Eves, and he talked to me for the book. But one of their ideas was to sort of like, let's take a step back and look. I mean, we've been launching rockets now to space for decades. Is there any way to get to space without a chemically fueled rocket? Let's just break it down from the very beginning. And so Jeff was, so I did get him to participate in the book, and he's recounting this. It's sort of Blue Origin was like really like a think tank, at the time. And Jeff said, well, you're going to want to know some of the crazy ideas we had, right? I'm like, yeah, of course. So he said, do you know how a bullwhip works? And I said, I don't know, what do you mean? He says, well, with a bullwhip, actually, the crack, it's capable of breaking the sound barrier. And so you actually do hear a sonic boom. And the way you're able to do that, just with the force of your arm is acceleration is mass times velocity. As the mass decreases, the acceleration increases, and it has that. So I was like, so you were going to bullwhip people into space? He's like, oh, no, we weren't going to throw people into space. That would be way too dangerous. But we were just thinking maybe we could fling a spacecraft up there. So I think that, it also, it shows a few things to me about, having an outside perspective, coming into, flying rockets to space. Is there a different way to do it? Is there a better way? Is there a cheaper way? And he decided, no, ultimately, chemically fueled rockets are the best way to do this, with a caveat that I'll get to in a minute. But one of the other stories I tell in the book that people don't know, and I think it really illustrates how passionate Jeff Bezos is about space and how serious he is. And this is important for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that he's the richest man in the world with, 160 billion. I mean, changes drastically every day. But, they say in reporting and journalism, follow the money. And he says that Blue Origin is the most important work he's doing. Which, us at the Washington Post, we try not to take offense to that, but understand. But given his passion for space, but to show, just how passionate he is about it, he talks about, I didn't catch the space bug until later, and in fact, had sort of, with the Challenger disaster, had a rough introduction to it. His was different. He was 5 years old. Watched the Apollo 11 lunar landing, and that memory was seared into him. And he talks about that in a way that I believe is sincere. So in 2013, he commissioned a trip to go recover the F1 engines that powered the Saturn V rocket, the Apollo rocket, to the moon. Now, those rockets were expendable. I mean, the first stages flew up. They had a stage separation, and the booster fell into the Atlantic Ocean, a few hundred miles off the coast of the Kennedy Space Center. So he commissioned basically one of the best underwater exploration teams. I mean, people have been veterans of going to find the Titanic, to go find these engines, which is, to a lot of people, just, I mean, let's face it, that's a little nuts. I mean, it's, on the bottom of the ocean, are you going to be able to find it? It had to cost them millions of bucks. What kind of shape are they going to be? And they're red hot, they're falling, they hit the ocean. And yet, they found them. Not only did they find them, they found the center engine from the Saturn V, from the Apollo 11. And those, there's an exhibit now at the Seattle Museum of Flight. I think there's one coming maybe next year on the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing at the Air and Space Museum in Washington. So that, I think, shows you, how passionate he is about space. I think a lot of people don't realize that. Maybe I'll talk real quickly about Richard Branson, too, and one of Jeff's other pursuits, which is this sort of the suborbital tourism missions. Their goal is to really open up space to the masses. And it's I trying to look at this with a journalistic detachment, but they're really close. I mean, I just being up in Virgin Galactic, they are on the verge of getting paying customers on suborbital flights that'll go up and down, and that you get, in both cases, about 4 minutes of weightlessness, and be able to unbuckle from your harness and float around the cabin and look out the windows from I think Blue Origin will go to 100 kilometers. I think Virgin will be a little bit less. They won't quite make the Kármán line, but they'll be above the 50-mile range and see the curvature of the Earth and the thin line of the atmosphere and the black sky, even though it's daytime, and the land mass, and just countries without borders. And there have been 560 people or so have been to space total, and that will begin to change. And I think a lot of people look at this, and I've raised these questions too. Is this sort of, and the tickets are very expensive. Virgin's going to charge $250,000. Are these joy rides for the rich? And I think in some respect they are, but I also think, if you for a moment take the optimistic view, and it's going to be very hard and very dangerous, and Virgin had a failure, and the spaceship came apart, and frankly, there were some careless things that I think went into that, and that the National Transportation Safety Board rightly took them to task for, that cost the life of one of those test pilots. But if they're able to do it successfully, in 10 years from now, 15 years from now, they're going on a regular basis, a weekly basis, taking people to space, and with that, the cost comes down. And so it gets to the point where 560 people becomes 5,600 people, and it grows, and now thousands or tens of thousands of people have been to space, and you're at your kid's soccer game or at some dinner party, and comes up, oh yeah, well my uncle did that, went to space, or someone who's been to space. So I think that's even though in some ways it's the least ambitious of what they're trying to accomplish, in some ways I think it'll have perhaps a really profound effect that that at least you can imagine it, and that's in the real short term. And not everyone wants to do that. Elon isn't. Well, he does have this Japanese billionaire that you may have seen. He wants to take on a trip around the moon with a rocket that doesn't yet exist, in a time frame that even he will admit is probably ridiculous. But that said, they anyway. So they've got all the different views. But one of the things where they are united, and that there is a common theme going through it, is that space is just too hard. It's too expensive. It's too difficult. It's too dangerous. It's too risky, and we don't do it very much. Right? And SpaceX launched last year 18 times, and it was a record for them, and it was more than governments had done in a single year. I think the space shuttle averaged like 5 launches a year over its 30-year history. And as Jeff Bezos would say, you get better with practice. You don't want to go to a surgeon who does the surgery he's about to do on you 18 times in a year, right? You want him to do it 18 times in a week. You want someone, and once you do that, and so, but the key, and this is going back to where Jeff was talking about, the slingshot's not going to work. A chemically fueled rocket is, in fact, the best way to work, but it has to be reusable. And so that's the key. Instead of that, that Saturn V first stage that got ditched in the ocean, that Jeff then went to recover the engines, you fly those back. And I'm sure you've seen these videos, but I think they're worth playing if you haven't seen them, because they're really just kind of extraordinary. The idea that a rocket can come back. And so the first video I'll play is Blue Origin's New Shepard. This is the suborbital vehicle. It'll go up, and the capsule will detach, and actually it'll have thrusters so that it'll spin, so that if you're up there, you can sort of stay by your window and look around. But this will show you the booster flying back, and it's the first time I did it And there's an interesting bit at the end that sort of shows their technological capability that you may not. This is at their site in West Texas. He's got something like 350,000 acres that he owns personally. I think here you see it best. Oh no, this is it. Yeah. So right there, if you notice what it did was, it got just a few feet off the ground and it said, uh-oh, I'm not in the right spot. And it scooted over to be right in the middle of the pad because it knew exactly where it was. You know, it's autonomous. It's a flying robot. And they saw that, and to get over it, had to do that maneuver, you know, to get over. And they said, and the engineers looked at it, and they almost say, that was working too well, right? It was good enough. I mean, let's not, you know, have that be the enemy of you know, of the good, the perfect. So they've now sort of changed it to give it a little bit more of a margin of error where it won't, you know, do that last minute scooch and if it doesn't need to. And now, another perspective, and you may remember too, there's, you know, these guys kind of went at it on Twitter over whose rocket landing was best. So this is SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket coming back on from you know, reaching orbital velocity and putting its payload into orbit. And this is a sped up version of what that looks like. Those are called grid fins that help steer and control the rocket. And you may see some of the thrusters. Yeah, there it is. Sort of aiming. And that's a re-entry burn coming back in through the atmosphere. And then the landing burn. And boom, on a ship. So one of the sort of the narrative tension in the book is, you know, you've got these two sort of titans of industry going at it. On Twitter, they really kind of went after each other over who landed first, which landing was more significant. Blue Origin actually had filed a patent on this technology, on landing on a ship at sea, and SpaceX took them to task on it. And they've had, you know, some moments of tension. Now they've, you know, at least publicly declared a truce. But I think that they also understand that competition for them is really good, and that in Elon and SpaceX need Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin to push each other. I mean, let's not forget, these are entrepreneurs who, you know, Amazon took on Barnes & Noble, took on Walmart, knows how to compete, knows how to break into an industry. Elon with PayPal and Tesla took on all of Detroit, right? So they know about competition. And I asked, at one point, when I interviewed Elon for the book, he said to me, he said, look, if I had a button that I could press and make Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin go away, I would not press that button because, you know, competition is good and he needs to be pushed. And, you know, I have a line, I think, in the book that competition is the best rocket fuel. And bring it back today. And we have time for questions because I really think this will be a good audience for that. I'll maybe be quiet after this and can talk and take your questions. But even just today, I mean, on my way over here, I had to scramble to write a story because Blue Origin just was awarded a contract from the Pentagon for $500 million. It's sort of the first significant contract that company has won from the government to allow it specifically to compete for these national security launch contracts, which in many ways, that's where the money is for these guys, to put it in direct competition with really SpaceX and a few others, but now you'll see that. So that just happened, a few hours ago. So I'll pause here and would really look forward to questions, and if you have any, and fire away.